It's a position Senator Bernie Sanders has expressed publicly before and a policy in his home state of Vermont. But the issue of felons voting while in prison didn't hit the national stage until a CNN town hall this week when a Harvard student asked if that view extended to murderers like the Boston Marathon bomber or sexual offenders.
If somebody commits a serious crime, sexual assault, murder, they're going to be punished. They may be in jail for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, their whole lives. That's what happens when you commit a serious crime. But I think the right to vote is inherent to our democracy. Yes, even for terrible people.
CNN's Chris Cuomo immediately pushed back, asking Sanders if he was writing his opponent's attack ads for them. But Sanders doubled down.
I think I have written many 30-second opposition ads throughout my life. This will be just another one. This is a democracy. We've got to expand that democracy. And I believe every single person does have the right to vote.
It's a controversial opinion. Only 2 states, Vermont and Maine, currently allow prisoners to vote, although Massachusetts was among them until the year 2000. And it is getting a lot of pushback, including from fellow Democratic candidates.
Should people convicted of sexual assault of the Boston Marathon bomber, should they be able to vote?
While incarcerated?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
Hard disagree. I prosecuted 2 people, sent them away for murder, for killing teenage African-American boys, one of them right outside the boys' school. That person should never have the right to vote.
People in prison don't vote, but when you get out, then absolutely you should have those rights restored.
And here in Boston, where the marathon bomber killed 4 people and injured dozens more 6 years ago, Mayor Marty Walsh is coming out against felon voting, telling the Boston Herald, quote, "I think that people that get out of prison, we should have conversations about that long term. But I think when somebody takes somebody's life, they lose the right to vote." So is this just another case of Bernie Sanders against the world, or is he shifting the debate once again? Joining me are Rahsaan Hall, the director of ACLU Massachusetts Racial Justice Program, and former Watertown Police Chief Ed Deveau, who was on the job during the marathon bombing and manhunt. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you very much.
Chief, let me start with you. How did you learn about Bernie Sanders' proposal the other night? Were you watching live, or did you catch up on it after the fact?
No, I learned probably through social media that evening, but I wasn't watching it live, no.
When you learned, what was your reaction?
Outrage. I just think when you get to talk about what happened here in Boston, where 2 individuals killed 4 people, including executing a police officer in his cruiser, it's outrageous to say that person can vote now or ever.
Rahsaan, since you have the chief right here and come down on a different side in this, how would you make the case to him that despite his understandable visceral reaction, that there's a greater good at play here?
Sure. I think one of the things that's important for us to recognize here is that the right to vote is the most fundamental right that we have, and it is preservative of all other rights. And so when we lose that, when we take that away from individuals, regardless of what they have done, it says something about how we value society. And I can understand certainly when people have done horrific things, horrible and terrible things, but there comes a point where we have to understand as a society that we are lifting up certain values, but also that we can't always be persuaded by the parade of horribles that people promote out in front to say this is the worst case scenario, and if you let this person vote, society will dissolve or come into shambles. And I think we really have to push back against that narrative, because everyone in prison is not the worst of the worst. Certainly there are people who have done bad, inappropriate, and in some instances horrible things. But again, thinking about the fundamental nature of this right, the value of this right, and the impact that it has, it's something that we should continue to
There are a lot of
on.
good people that haven't done horrible things. I agree with that. But we have to set an example. I've been to Colorado with the Supermax prison and walked down and saw the Unabomber, Oklahoma bombers, people, white supremacists who had killed prison guards and other people to end up in prison. Horrible people. I can't understand anybody with the support that someone like that can vote. Those are the horrible of the horrible. But while you're in prison, I think you lose some of your rights. You lose a lot of your rights. And one of them here in Massachusetts is the right to vote. And I think it's a good decision, especially on when Bernie Sanders is confronted with the people who we talked about, sex offenders, murderers, Boston bombers, and saying, yes, I think they should vote. I lose my support.
I want to talk about Massachusetts history in just a moment and get to the question of whether there might be some kind of middle ground between the two of you. But first, I want to just really briefly mention Bernie Sanders' history with this. He, as far as we can tell, floated this idea on the campaign trail a couple weeks ago at a campaign stop in Iowa. I didn't remember this popping up in 2016 as an issue. We found some video, which we can take a look at now, of some comments he made in 2016. And then I want you to tell me if he's on the same page now as he was back then. So let's look.
What criminal justice is supposed to be about is you committed a crime, you were found guilty, you pay the price. I'm not aware that paying the price includes taking away your rights to participate in a democratic society. I'm not aware of that. All right, you paid your price, right? As happens in my state of Vermont, felons can vote. I believe that should be the case all over America. It's an outrage.
So that video is from the citizen journalism site, The Uptake, and when I watched it, it seemed like he was kind of saying two different things. To the gentleman who asked him the question, who was a released felon, saying, you've paid your debt, you should be able to vote now, but then saying everywhere should be like Vermont. Was he where he is on this issue now in the last campaign, as far as you know?
I mean, it appears that he is. I mean, it's hard to tell without the full context, but my hearing this for the first time was that he said that he did not believe that people should have their right to vote taken away from them. And that begins at the moment that they are convicted. And
so if he was saying things like this last time around, why is this just popping as an issue today, do you two think?
Well, I think it's changed. I think he's saying, it's very clear now, he's saying while you're in prison and where the barrier is, it's anybody.
So you're picking up on a shift.
Yeah.
Okay.
I see a serious shift.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's another important part of this conversation about why this is picking up so much energy and attention is because there's a different narrative that exists about what the criminal legal system is doing. There's a different narrative around race and racism within this system and how people of color, specifically black and Latinx folks, are disproportionately represented in this system, and then how felon disenfranchisement has deep roots in Jim Crow and in the post-slavery era as a way to disenfranchise people. And when you think about Massachusetts, for example, black and Latinx folks make up roughly 25% of the state's population, but make up 54% of the people who are incarcerated. And so, again, running with the narrative of the worst, we're excluding a whole segment of society from being involved in this most fundamental exercise of rights.
I'm embarrassed to admit that I hadn't known until I was doing research for this segment that Massachusetts was among the states that let incarcerated felons vote until pretty recently. In 2000, tell me if I have this history right, because you guys know it better than me. In 2000, there was a ballot initiative that had been proposed by then Governor Cellucci a few years earlier. It took away the right to vote from incarcerated felons in almost every race. I think it let them continue voting for president and governor, but that was taken away legislatively the following year. But we used to be doing things the way Bernie Sanders says the country should be doing things. Is that an argument in favor of Sanders' position, that actually the status quo right now is not etched in stone but came to pass pretty recently?
Well, it changed, and I think it changed because of public opinion, that they shouldn't be able to vote while they're in prison. I think there should be a good conversation about when you leave prison, whether you get your rights back to vote. I don't know how that happens, if a parole board's a part of that discussion, and I think that should be viewed. But while somebody is in prison, I feel strongly that they shouldn't be able to be allowed to vote, and Massachusetts changed their rules because of it.
Well, and I think what's problematic about it is the initiative back that was introduced in '97 came around people who were incarcerated organizing, and this fear-mongering that happens.
They were organizing a political action committee, right?
Right.
And
so
Governor
that
Cellucci came out and said, no, you can't do that, and we're going to take away this.
Right. And so this belief that if people in prisons are allowed to organize, that the prison will be run by the prisoners, or that they will overwhelm the local municipality in their elections, or that they would make laws that makes it softer for them. But if we believe that there is redemptive value in humanity, humanity, that the prison institutions are supposed to be restoring people, that then we should be making an investment in making sure that people are civically engaged. There are folks who are incarcerated right now, a young man by the name of Derek Washington who runs this group called Mass Power, Massachusetts prisoners, organizers working for enfranchisement and restoration, that are really trying to lift up the importance of enfranchisement, because there are men who are incarcerated who have children out in the community. They want to be able to vote on what's happening with educational funding, or who have parents who are suffering with health care issues. They want to be able to vote on what we do with health care, and to say that because you have committed an offense and you are incarcerated on this offense, that you are somehow removed from society, not only physically, but your voice to encourage or to speak to what are the values that you lift up or that are important to you, says something about how we value this democracy.
If we locked you two guys in the green room for about an hour after the show, I'm wondering if you could come to some sort of halfway meeting point where you agreed to disagree and maybe found a little common ground. As the chief has said, there is a visceral reaction, I think, for a lot of people, not just people in law enforcement, when you have someone who has committed exceptionally heinous acts. The idea of them being deprived of the franchise doesn't necessarily seem objectionable. A lot of people feel like it's common sense. On the other hand, Chief, I was looking at a list of some of the felonies here in Massachusetts. It's not all murder or manslaughter or horrible crimes. I mean, failure to report lobbying expenditures is a felony. Trafficking in food stamps is a felony. You know the list better than me, but there's some small potatoes from my vantage point by comparison offenses, and then there's the real biggies. Why not come up with an interim solution? Say, okay, we're going to give people who are incarcerated the right to vote if they have committed crimes up to a certain point, but then beyond that point, we're going to say, no, you've forfeited that right. Is that something you guys could agree to?
I think I would be, I mean, not that I am a decision maker here, but
yeah.
I would certainly be open to that conversation, even at the sentencing part. If judges made those decisions and said, you know, this, I don't deem this a serious felony, in some of the felonies that you talked about, and would they be allowed to vote and having decisions and have the prosecutors and the defendant's attorney weigh in on that, on lesser felonies, and there are a number of them in this state, and felonies are different in every state. So I think we could have a conversation about that. But I think what Bernie Sanders just hit the panic button by doing this, upset a lot of people. As you know, I'm very involved with the survivors of the Boston Marathon. We had the 60th anniversary. Everybody's together, and then this comes out days later. Everybody's trying to heal and move on, and using the Boston Marathon bomber as an example. And I understand
just for
that it's the horrible people, but
probably worth mentioning, it was the questioner who brought up the bomber as opposed to Senator Sanders. Rahsaan, I think you got the last word here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, understanding the deep racist roots around this, and even though Cellucci moved for this in 1997, it was on the heels of this kind of tough on crime approach to prisoners organizing to make their conditions better and to be engaged in civil society, but to also know that we can't begin making lines of demarcation about what felonies are the worst felonies or not, and that we haven't even talked about the impact that it has on people who are wrongfully convicted, who never get their right to vote back. But if we value this fundamental right and believe that it is preservative of all rights, no matter what someone has done, we have to continue to engage in making this right the most fundamental and most important and most protected right.
All right, we've got to leave it there. Rahsaan Hall, Chief Ed Deveau, thank you both for being here.
Thank you.